The federal government of Germany consists of the Federal Chancellor and the federal ministers. It should translate the political will of the parliamentary majority into practical politics. The federal government has the task of political leadership. It is intended to translate the political will of the parliamentary majority into practical politics, as I said, and shape the internal relations as well as the foreign relations of the Federal Republic of Germany. They also have the responsibility for implementing the laws by the federal authorities. The federal government consists of the Federal Chancellor and the federal ministers, as I said, who together form the cabinet. The Federal Chancellor is elected by the Bundestag on the proposal of the federal president. The federal ministers are appointed by the federal president on the recommendation of the Federal Chancellor. In political practice, the formation of a government precedes the election of the Federal Chancellor. The designated Chancellor, who has always been the leader of the strongest political group in Parliament, negotiates the government program together with the parties participating in the government, that's the so-called coalition partners, and determines the number and areas of responsibility of the federal ministers. He gives them certain cabinet seats and their staffing. He must also ensure that important groups and currents of his own party, strong national associations, and last but not least, women are duly taken into account in the distribution of ministerial posts. By the way, when I said the strongest party, only the strongest of the coalition. There were parties winning the elections but not having the chancellor. Happened a lot of time. The responsibilities with the federal government are laid down in the Constitution in Article 65. The federal chancellor determines the guidelines of politics and bears responsibility for them. Within these guidelines, every federal minister has his own business independently and under his own responsibility. Disputes between the federal ministers are decided by the federal government. The federal chancellor conducts his business according to a procedure approved by the federal government and approved by the federal president. The article contains the three principles that govern the work of the federal government. The first one is the chancellor principle, the second one the departmental principle, and the third the collegial principle. The federal chancellor has an outstanding position in the federal government. This is the chancellor principle. It shows in that he or she is the only member of the federal government elected by the Bundestag, the federal parliament, and thus has a special democratic legitimacy. He may petition alone for the Bundestag to express its confidence in him. A refusal of the vote of confidence can lead to new elections. He can only be overthrown solely by a vote of no confidence, whereby all his ministers lose their office. And he has the right to propose the federal ministers for appointment and dismissal. That's Article 64 of the Constitution, while the Bundestag cannot force a minister to resign. He determines the policy guidelines and is solely responsible for them. Policy competence is the principal authority of the Chancellor. It assigns him leadership in the cabinet, and he cannot be overruled by a majority in the cabinet. The Constitution gives the Chancellor the opportunity to keep his cabinet tight. How he uses them depends on his personality, also on the support of his party and faction, and the weight of his coalition partners. The first federal chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, from 1949 to 1963, had such an undisputed position of power that for his reign the slogan was created of the chancellor democracy. Looking back, it can be seen that Adenauer's strong position was not so much derived from the competence of the directive, but was due to his personality and the political constellation of that time. The subsequent chancellors have used their competence in directives in very different ways, depending on the political situation and also their personal leadership style. And we have to talk about the Federal Chancellery. In the Federal Chancellery, the Federal Chancellor has a comprehensive staff, which serves as coordination point for government policy. The office keeps in contact with the ministries and the federal authorities so that it can inform the Chancellor at any time about their work and provide him with the necessary expertise for the cabinet consultations. At the same time, it has the role of a secretariat of the federal government. It prepares the meetings and decisions of the cabinet. The head of the Federal Chancellery has the rank of a federal minister. And something very important nowadays is the Federal Press Office. The Federal Chancellor is also subject to the Press and Information Office of the federal government, or the Federal Press Office for short. It is headed by a Secretary of State who is also government spokesman. The Federal Press Office informs the public at home and abroad about the policy of the federal government. It publishes the bulletin, press releases, and newsletters and keeps in touch with the media. The spokesman for the government and the spokespersons of the ministries regularly appear before the Federal Press Conference, that's the Association of Correspondents in Berlin, to deliver official statements by the federal government and to answer questions. At the same time, the office has the task of gathering and evaluating news and informing the federal government about public opinion at home and abroad. And of course, we have to talk about the federal ministers a bit as well. The cabinet currently comprises of ministers with their own ministry and a federal minister for special tasks, or who is the head of the federal chancellery. The number and responsibilities of ministers reflects the constant expansion of state responsibilities. I don't name the number now because over time it will change. It just changed, and so leave it out for a general one. In earlier times, the classic ministries for domestic, foreign, defense, justice, and finance, which had already been created in 1809 by the Prussian administrative reform of Freiherr von Stein, were sufficient for the state purposes of ensuring security at home and abroad. They are still among the most important and sought-after ministries today. The Minister of Finance has a prominent position in the Constitution. He draws up the budget and coordinates the financial requirements of the other ministries. In practice, without his consent, no expenses can be incurred. The Justice and Home Affairs ministers examine each law for its constitutional and legal formality. The welfare state of the 21st century is expected to provide for the well-being of all citizens, above all to guarantee economic stability, to balance social differences, and to provide all the facilities and services vital to industrial society. The public functions of general interest require the establishment of appropriate ministries, especially for the economy, for work and social affairs, for families, seniors, women and youth, for health, and for transport. New state tasks have led to the creation of further ministries such as education, research and technology, and above all, the environment and nature conservation. Some ministries have only the task of enacting laws and the corresponding ordinances. Others are also subject to administrative authorities. I earlier talked about the department principle. Each federal minister, within the guidelines determined by the Federal Chancellor for the entire government policy, manages his own business independently and on his own responsibility. The responsibility of the ministers requires a precise demarcation of the ministries. That's not always possible. For example, the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation is primarily responsible for development aid, but it also touches on matters relating to the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Economic Affairs. And I also named the principle of collegiality. In cases of disagreements between ministers, the federal government decides by majority vote. This is to say that the cabinet is a quorum of equal ministers. The cabinet also advises on all important political issues, but it cannot overrule the Federal Chancellor. A minister is obliged to represent decisions of the cabinet even if he has not agreed to them. That's the so-called cabinet discipline. In practice, of the three principles, the Chancellor principle and the departmental principle have become politically effective. Despite all differences in the administration, the Chancellor has always determined general policy and concrete initiatives have come from ministers. The cabinet, on the other hand, does not play a significant role as a political decision-making body. In it, they are influential ministers anyway. More importantly, personalities of great political importance are not members of the cabinet, such as, for example, the group or faction leaders, however you want to call them. The political direction of a federal ministry consists of the minister and one or more parliamentary state secretaries. In the Federal Chancellery and in the Foreign Office, they carry the title of Minister of State. The office was created in 1967, initially for 7 ministries. The federal government, which has been in office since 2021, had state ministers in parliament, parliamentary state secretaries, of course. They are also deputies, and above all, they want to keep the connection between their ministry and the Bundestag. They represent the minister in committees and during question time, but also at cabinet meetings and in the public. At the head of the ministerial bureaucracy is an official state secretary, usually an administrative expert. In larger ministries, there are 2 or 3 secretaries of state. Each ministry is divided into several departments, these in turn divided into subdivisions with several units. The work unit is the unit responsible for a specific area of expertise. Large ministries have up to 100 units. Secretaries of state and department heads are political officials. They can always be transferred to temporary retirement, of course. This happens occasionally in a ministerial change and often in a change of government. The new minister should be able to choose top officials who agree with him politically. But we always had coalitions, and so the important decisions have long been taken in informal bodies. Even the government statement, the detailed presentation of the program of a new government at the beginning of the legislature, is negotiated in a coalition agreement. Thereafter, the coalition round meets when there's a need for political decision-making. In addition to the Chancellor, some ministers, the group leaders of the coalition parties, they include other influential representatives and some top officials. This body advises forthcoming legislative proposals, important political decisions, and the strategy to be applied, and settles conflict between the coalition partners. So it's a bit more complicated than an absolute majority, but if you don't have first past the post like in some countries, I still think it's less democratic to have first past the post, so I prefer our system here. And then there's always the need for coalitions. But so far it worked. And I'll see you in my next video. Bis gleich.